So welcome to today's lesson. So now we're finished with our water use. So we've covered freshwater and marine. We were going to go on to energy, but I thought just given that we're online and things that are going on in the world today, it actually made sense to skip around a little bit and do chapter 14. So we're going to talk about environmental health and toxicology. And as you'll see shortly, it kind of ties in to a lot of things that are going on right now. So basically, we're going to look at how scientists and policymakers study toxic substances and other environmental health risks. Okay, and so those health risks that we're actually going to start with is going to be talking about different types of diseases, for instance. Okay, so there's basically 4 types of environmental hazards that we're going to sort of briefly mention. So physical hazard, as you can see from the picture, a little sunburn, these are things that arise from processes that occur naturally in our environment. And they pose risk to human life or health. So UV light is obviously something we can't avoid completely, but we could cover up, we could add sunscreens, so we can use modifications to lessen the risk. Other things that might include physical hazards would be things like earthquakes, volcanoes, fires, floods, hurricanes, things that we've talked about in other chapters. So again, we can't really avoid them, but sometimes our choices can either make them worse or they can lessen the effects. So where do we build? What types of buildings do we use? Think about, we just finished talking about wetlands and their protective benefit for coastlines. So there are a variety of things we can do to sort of mitigate these types of hazards. All right, chemical hazards, we'll talk about these a little bit more in part 2, but these are those pesticides, pharmaceuticals, synthetic chemicals, things that are more and more a part of our everyday life. What are the hazards they present, and what kind of things can we do to help mitigate them? Biological hazards. So these are basically hazards that result from ecological interactions among organisms. So this might be becoming sick from a virus, a bacterial infection, or some other pathogen. And so these basically are parasites. They use us to reproduce, and in the process, we get sick. And then the last type are cultural hazards. And these result from our place of residence, our socioeconomic status, our occupation. As you can see in this picture, it's smoking, so it could be a behavioral choice. And again, these are things that we can minimize or prevent, but sometimes some things are beyond our control. So we may make the good decision not to smoke, but we could be still exposed to other people who do smoke, depending on where we live or, what kinds of places we frequent. This is one area that I just want to sort of briefly mention. People tie back into the idea of environmental justice, because sometimes where poor people live is going to be correlated with more of these cultural hazards. So they may not be able to move away from a toxic waste site, or they may be more likely to be working with pesticides, for instance. All right, so we're going to start talking about biological hazards. So mostly we're going to focus on infectious diseases. So these are basically caused by pathogenic microbes that attack us directly. All right, so the most common ones are bacteria and viruses, but also various protists can cause diseases. So they can attack us directly, or infection could occur through a vector. So this is frequently some type of insect. So malaria is a mosquito-borne disease because the mosquitoes transmit the vector between hosts. All right, we can also have non-infectious diseases. These are things that might be affected by genes, environment, lifestyle. They develop without the action of a foreign organism. Examples would be heart disease or cancer. And so obviously sometimes you can't avoid these. As we've said above, they're affected by our genes. But we can adapt healthier lifestyles, avoid environments that might increase our odds of some of these things. So it's, again, a kind of combination of factors. All right, so let's start off. We're going to talk about different types of diseases. So here we have a pie chart showing the leading causes of death across the world. And so about a quarter, a little bit more than a quarter, are due to infectious diseases. And if we look over here, we see respiratory infections are the most common, followed by AIDS, diarrheal diseases, TB, malaria, and then childhood diseases. So these are things that we think of in developed countries as mostly taken care of by vaccines or good medical care. But in many parts of the world, these are still a problem. All right, if we go back to our pie chart, you can see that non-infectious diseases actually accounts for more than half of our causes of death around the world. All right, so infectious diseases. So as I said, these are caused by microbes, which is just a general category for small things, basically. So this can include viruses and bacteria. And as I said, it also involves protists. So malaria is caused by a protist. There are some that are caused by different types of amoeba, for instance. There are diverse approaches to fighting these types of diseases. So it wasn't until the late 1800s before people really even made the connection between diseases and microbes, right? They used to think it was bad smelling air that caused diseases, for instance. They didn't really understand because they couldn't see the microbes, so they didn't understand this connection. As they made this connection, that led to a whole bunch of societal approaches. So better sanitary facilities, right? Wastewater treatment plants, treating drinking water to sterilize it, nutritious diet, so increasing the immune system, and increased medical care, whether that involves treatment, quarantining, early interventions. So these have really been able to drastically reduce some of the occurrences of some types of infectious diseases. And then education campaigns, so telling people what to avoid or what types of behaviors are best practices, also is used to fight infectious diseases. All right, but obviously they still remain a concern, as we know today, as we are all at home viewing this lecture instead of in school. So I thought I'd just start with two words that you've probably heard a lot. So epidemic. This is a widespread occurrence of an infectious disease in a community at a particular time. So this can have a pretty big impact, but it's going to be in a more limited area. All right, a pandemic, we're generally thinking something that is going to be prevalent and spread throughout the world or many countries. All right, I know a lot of you are probably following, when was the World Health Organization going to say that COVID-19 was a pandemic? All right, and they waited till they got a certain amount of community spread in a certain number of places. All right, recent examples of various epidemics and pandemics. There was SARS in 2003, H5N1, so this is a variety of flu, Ebola, you guys might remember from a few years ago. So obviously these things still occur, and sometimes they take us by surprise, which is kind of what's happening now. And one of the reasons that this happens is because microbes mutate. So in the case of COVID-19, right, we saw something that was normally present in an animal that was able to jump across and become and be able to infect humans and actually be transmitted from human to human. They can also, things like bacteria can evolve resistance to antibiotics, which can make things that used to not be a problem all of a sudden become a problem. And global warming and human activities can affect what we're seeing. So global warming, think of vector-borne diseases where a mosquito carries it. Well, as warming increases, then where those mosquitoes are present may increase. Human activities, right? Now all of a sudden we're, burning areas of the jungle. We're coming in closer contact with a lot of animals that may be carrying some of these viruses. And so as we become closer in proximity, then the chances of it jumping from an animal to a human actually increase. Okay? All right, so as part of the assignment for today, and this will also post on Google Classroom, but basically you're going to go to Google Docs and you're going to sign up for an infectious disease, and you're going to make a short Flipgrid video that describes the disease. So I've just listed a few things. This may vary between diseases. Some will have like an interesting history, some might not, but you want to think about these things. Some really good resources are the CDC, so the Centers for Disease Control, so this is in the US, and the World Health Organization. So they both have really nice websites that go through and give a lot of information about the various diseases. After you've posted your Flipgrid, you're going to go and comment on 3 others. Okay? All right, so I thought I would start off and talk about West Nile virus. So West Nile is the leading cause of mosquito-borne disease in the U.S. And you can see from this map it was first detected in New England in 1999, and then it kind of quickly spread to most of the U.S. in the following years. Usually it has no symptoms or very mild symptoms. People may not even be aware they have it. Sometimes it progresses into more flu-like symptoms, so headache, body ache, skin rash, swollen lymph glands. And in a few people, it can become very serious and sometimes fatal if it enters the brain. So it might cause encephalitis, which is a brain inflammation, or meningitis, which is when the coverings of the brain, the membranes become inflamed. All right, it's especially serious for people with weakened immune systems. There are currently, at least in people, no vaccines or medicines. And so the best treatment is to avoid mosquito bites. And people will do this once West Nile starts cropping up. Sometimes you'll hear it in Maryland. They will start public service announcements, cover up, don't go out when mosquitoes are most active, use mosquito repellents, and sometimes they'll actually spray areas to knock down the mosquito population. Okay, and here's the transmission cycle. So West Nile is a vector-borne disease. So it's carried by mosquitoes, and particularly these Culex species. And usually it's actually a disease that affects birds, all right, and especially corvids, so ravens and jays are affected. And so sometimes people will collect dead birds to monitor how much West Nile virus is in a given area. But it infects most bird species. Some become sick, some don't. And the birds actually then, the virus can amplify enough so that it can maintain this spread between mosquito and birds. It can also affect both horses and humans, but we're considered dead-end hosts. So while we might get sick, the virus doesn't amplify enough that it can be respread by the mosquitoes, if that makes sense. Okay? All right. So that's a little bit of an introduction into chapter 14. So go ahead and read through those first few pages. And then go ahead and on Google Classroom, you should see your assignment be posted. All right. I hope you all are having a good day. I know it's a little bit weird being sort of stuck at home, but I hope all is well. See you tomorrow.